A woman in a sensory deprivation tank feels something slimy touch her leg. The staff, over an intercom, assures her it's just a hallucination, part of the therapy. But the touches become more insistent, more intimate, and she finds her own body responding with a shameful pleasure. The walls were a sterile, shadowless white. The air was a carefully curated cocktail of scents, a blend of clean, sharp ozone and the expensive, earthy fragrance of rare essential oils. A profound silence permeated the space, a heavy, weighted quiet broken only by the faint, distant whisper of trickling water. This was a sanctuary of tranquility, an elite spa that promised not just relaxation, but a complete erasure of the self, a baptism in absolute peace. It was a place designed to make the outside world, with all its noise and jagged edges, cease to exist. Her chosen procedure was called total sensory deprivation. The brochure had described it in hushed, reverent tones, speaking of a return to a primal, womb-like state, a complete reset of the mind and body. She had been led through a series of minimalist corridors, each one quieter and more serene than the last, a deliberate, architectural descent into absolute calm. The world she had left behind just an hour ago already felt like a distant, half-forgotten memory, a noisy dream from which she was now gratefully, luxuriously awakening. She was shown into a private room, the centerpiece of which was a shallow, built-in pool. It was filled with a water so black it seemed to absorb the soft, indirect light of the room, a perfect, liquid void that promised nothingness. It was not the inviting blue of a recreational pool, but the profound, absolute black of a starless, midnight sky. It looked like a pool of polished obsidian, its surface a flawless, unbroken mirror that reflected only the stark white ceiling above, a perfect inversion of the room's stark palette. The water was warm, its temperature precisely calibrated to match that of the human body, designed to blur the line between skin and liquid. It was dense and buoyant with dissolved salts, a solution engineered to hold her effortlessly on its surface, to cradle her in a state of perfect, gravity-defying weightlessness. This was not just water, it was an environment, a carefully constructed medium for the dissolution of the self, a place where the physical boundaries of the body were meant to be forgotten, to melt away into the surrounding warmth and dark. A calm, disembodied voice from an unseen instructor explained the final steps of the process. Soon, the soft lights would fade to complete blackness. The faint sound of trickling water would cease, leaving only an absolute, perfect silence. She would be left alone, floating in the warm, dark, and silent void, with nothing but the quiet, internal rhythm of her own thoughts for company. It was an invitation to a state of being she had craved for years, a chance to be utterly, completely, and luxuriously alone, free from all external sensation. She lay back in the water, and it received her with a soft, silken embrace. Her limbs floated, her head was supported, her body held in a state of perfect, effortless suspension. The last thing she saw before the lights began their slow, gentle fade was the pure white ceiling reflected in the black water below. Then, the world dissolved. The light vanished, the last vestiges of sound faded away, and the feeling of her own body, its weight and its boundaries, melted into the velvety, all-encompassing darkness of the pool. She was adrift in a warm, comfortable, and perfect void. At first, there was only bliss. The sensation of her own body, its weight, its aches, its defined and solid boundaries, simply ceased to exist. She was a disembodied consciousness, a floating point of awareness in a universe of warm, velvety blackness. Her thoughts, which had been a frantic, chaotic race just an hour before, began to slow, their sharp, anxious edges softening and dissolving into the profound, peaceful silence. The worries of the day, the deadlines, the anxieties, the endless, churning internal monologue, it all faded into a distant, irrelevant hum. She was floating in a perfect, primal void, a state of pre-birth tranquility that was both deeply alien and profoundly familiar. Time lost all meaning. Seconds could have been minutes, minutes could have been hours. There was only the gentle, rhythmic pulse of her own slow heartbeat, the faint, internal sound of her own breathing, the only remaining anchors to her physical self in this vast, sensory vacuum. This was the promised erasure, the complete and utter nullification of the self, and it was more peaceful, more deeply restorative, than she could have ever imagined. And then, she felt it. After an immeasurable period of perfect, uninterrupted stillness, a new sensation intruded upon her blissful solitude. It was a light, almost imperceptible touch on her left ankle. Something smooth, cool, and impossibly soft, like a length of wet silk, brushed against her skin for a fleeting, gossamer moment. The sensation was so faint, so unexpected, that she instantly dismissed it. It was a phantom, a product of her own mind, her sensory-deprived brain creating a ghost of a touch to fill the absolute, tactile void. She willed her body to remain relaxed, to sink back into the perfect, peaceful stillness. It was just her imagination, a harmless neurological quirk. But the touch came again, this time a little higher, a slow, deliberate caress on the curve of her calf. It was no longer a fleeting, dismissive brush. It was a clear, definite, and undeniably external sensation. It was a touch that did not originate from within her own mind. A small, involuntary tremor of alarm ran through her, a tiny, electric ripple that disturbed the perfect, glassy stillness of the black water. Her sudden movement, the small splash she made in the otherwise silent pool, must have triggered a sensor. From a hidden speaker somewhere in the ceiling above her, the calm, disembodied voice of the administrator materialized in the darkness, a soft, reassuring balm on her rising anxiety. The voice was smooth, professional, and utterly untroubled. It explained, with a detached, clinical confidence, that any and all tactile sensations she might be experiencing were a perfectly normal and expected part of the therapeutic process. They were hallucinations, it said. Phantoms created by the brain. The voice explained the science behind the phenomenon in a calm, soothing monotone. In the absence of any external stimuli, the brain, which is a pattern-seeking machine, will often begin to create its own sensory input. It will create lights in the darkness, sounds in the silence, and, yes, even the sensation of touch on the skin. These were not real, the voice assured her. They were simply the ghosts of memory, the echoes of past sensations, the random firings of neurons in a mind that was, for the first time, truly, and completely, alone with itself. The explanation was logical. It was scientific. It was reassuring. She clung to it, a drowning woman grasping at a perfectly rational, scientifically sound life raft. Of course. It was a hallucination. Her mind was playing tricks on her, creating a ghost in the machine of her own nervous system. The profound, womb-like peace of the tank had been so absolute, so complete, that her brain had simply panicked and invented a sensation to fill the void. The relief was immense. The fear began to recede, replaced by a sense of faint, slightly embarrassed amusement at her own suggestibility. She took a deep, slow breath, a conscious effort to release the tension that had gathered in her shoulders. She willed her muscles to relax, to surrender once more to the warm, buoyant embrace of the water. The voice was right. She had to trust the process. She had to let go of her fear, to accept the phantom touches as a natural and harmless byproduct of the deep, meditative state she was in. She had to embrace the hallucination, to allow her mind to do its strange, unpredictable work. The fear was the enemy, not the sensation itself. She focused on the feeling of the water on her skin, on the sensation of her own slow, steady breathing. She sank back into the warm, dark, and silent void, her brief, panicked excursion to the surface of reality now feeling like a distant, slightly foolish memory. She was safe. She was in a controlled environment. She was in the hands of professionals. The phantom touches were not a threat, they were a sign that the therapy was working, that her mind was beginning to open up, to explore the strange, unmapped territories of its own inner landscape. But the phantom was a persistent one. A few moments after she had settled back into a state of calm, the touch came again. This time, it was not a fleeting brush. It was a firm, deliberate, and undeniably physical pressure. Something smooth and flexible, like a thick, muscular rope, wrapped itself around her leg, its grip gentle but firm. It was a sensation that was too complex, too specific, too sustained, to be a simple neurological glitch. The calm, rational explanation of the administrator's voice began to feel thin and unconvincing, a flimsy shield against a rising, undeniable, and deeply tactile truth. The thing that was touching her was not a memory. It was not a phantom. It was not a hallucination. It was real. And it was in the water with her. The blissful, solitary peace of the tank was a lie. The perfect, empty void was not empty. She was not alone in the darkness. She was sharing this small, enclosed, and perfectly black space with something else, something that was silent, unseen, and now, very, very tangible. And the calm, reassuring voice of the administrator was no longer a comfort, it was the voice of a liar, the soothing, deceptive patter of a zookeeper trying to calm a nervous animal just before feeding time. She forced herself to relax. The voice had been persuasive, its clinical, confident tone a powerful antidote to her rising panic. It was just her mind. A sensory hallucination. A phantom limb for the entire body. She closed her eyes, a redundant gesture in the absolute, ink-black darkness, and focused on her breathing, a slow, steady, meditative rhythm. She would not let her fear get the better of her. She would not be spooked by the ghosts of her own nervous system. She would surrender to the experience, accept the strange, tactile illusions as a part of the journey. But the touches didn't stop. They intensified. They were no longer the fleeting, questioning caresses of a moment before. They became more insistent, more purposeful. The smooth, flexible thing that had wrapped itself around her ankle began to move, its grip tightening slightly as it ascended her leg in a slow, exploratory spiral. Its movements were not random. They were fluid, confident, and utterly deliberate, the movements of a creature that was mapping her body, learning the shape and texture of her with a calm, scientific precision. It explored the curve of her calf, the sensitive hollow behind her knee, the long, smooth expanse of her thigh. There was an intelligence in its touch, a sense of a mind guiding the exploration. This was not the random firing of neurons, this was a systematic, tactile examination, and she was the specimen. The cold, hard knot of fear in her stomach began to dissolve, but it was not replaced by relief. It was replaced by something else, a strange, new, and deeply unsettling emotion that she could not immediately name. It was a complex cocktail of revulsion, curiosity, and a faint, shameful flicker of something else. Her mind was screaming in terror, a silent, frantic monologue of denial and horror. But her body, in a profound and shocking act of betrayal, began to respond to the stimulus in a different way. The initial, adrenalized tension in her muscles began to soften, to ease. The touch, which should have been a source of pure, unadulterated revulsion, was not unpleasant. The texture of the thing that was touching her was smooth, sleek, and cool, and its firm, steady pressure was, in a deeply unnerving way, almost comforting, almost sensual. A strange, shameful feeling began to bloom in the pit of her stomach, a warm, liquid sensation that was a bizarre and unwelcome counterpoint to the cold, rational terror in her mind. Her body, a traitor to her conscious will, was responding to the intimate, exploratory touch with a faint, trembling excitement. It was not a tremor of fear. It was a tremor of a dark, illicit, and deeply repressed pleasure. She was being violated by an unseen, unknown entity, and a deep, primal, and utterly amoral part of her was, on some level, enjoying it. The shame of this realization was more terrifying than the touch itself. It was a profound, internal horror, a sudden, shocking revelation of a hidden, darker self she had never known existed. She had always thought of herself as a rational, civilized, and modern woman, in complete control of her own desires, her own body. But in the warm, dark, sensory vacuum of the tank, stripped of all the external cues and internal defenses of the civilized world, a more ancient, more primal part of her had been awakened. And that part of her was not afraid. It was curious. The single, exploratory tendril was now joined by others. She could feel them moving in the water all around her, a silent, unseen school of sleek, muscular forms. They began to explore the rest of her body, their touches no longer tentative, but confident, almost possessive. They slid over her stomach, their cool, smooth texture a shocking contrast to the warmth of the water. They wrapped themselves around her arms, their grip gentle but inescapable. They traced the line of her collarbone, the curve of her neck, their movements a slow, sensuous, and deeply unnerving dance. She was no longer floating alone in a sensory deprivation tank. She was being held, cradled, and explored by a multitude of unseen limbs. The initial, singular point of contact had expanded into a full-body embrace, a complete and total tactile immersion. The fear and the shame were still there, a cold, hard knot in her consciousness, but they were being drowned out by the sheer, overwhelming intensity of the physical sensation. Her mind, her rational, civilized mind, was losing the battle. Her body, with its ancient, amoral appetites, was winning. She felt the water shift around her, a slow, heavy displacement, as if something of immense size and weight were moving beneath her. She was no longer just being touched by a collection of disembodied tendrils. She was being held in the embrace of a single, massive entity, a creature whose full size and shape she could not even begin to comprehend. The individual, exploratory touches coalesced into a single, unified, and all-encompassing caress. She was no longer a specimen being examined. She was a partner in a strange, silent, and deeply intimate dance. She gave up. The fight was over. Her will, her identity, her sense of self, it had all dissolved into the warm, black water, a willing and almost grateful surrender to the overwhelming, sensual power of the unknown. She was no longer a person. She was a body, a collection of nerve endings, a purely sensory organism responding to a stimulus it could not understand but could no longer resist. She was in the arms of a monster, and in the deep, dark, and silent heart of the void, she had found not terror, but a strange, shameful, and deeply seductive kind of peace. The panic began to recede, not driven away by a conscious act of will, but simply displaced, crowded out by the sheer, overwhelming novelty of the new sensation. The initial, sharp-edged fear was being supplanted by a strange and deeply alien feeling, a complex and intoxicating cocktail of revulsion, fascination, and a profound, shameful pleasure. Her mind, the rational, modern part of her, was still screaming, a silent, horrified witness to the violation, but its voice was growing fainter, drowned out by the rising, insistent chorus of a more ancient, more primal part of her nature. The touches became more intimate, more confident. The initial, hesitant explorations were over. The creature, whatever it was, had finished its preliminary mapping of her body. Now, it was beginning its work in earnest. There were dozens of them now, a multitude of sleek, powerful, and impossibly smooth appendages, all moving in a coordinated, intelligent symphony of touch. They slid over the sensitive skin of her stomach, their coolness a shocking and not unpleasant contrast to the warm, saline water. They wrapped themselves around her arms, her legs, their grip gentle but inescapable, a silken, living web that held her suspended in the darkness. They explored every inch of her, a silent, meticulous, and deeply invasive examination. They traced the delicate bones of her wrists, the curve of her hips, the hollow of her throat. It was the touch of a blind sculptor, learning the form and texture of its clay before beginning to mold it into a new shape. There was a profound, almost reverent quality to the exploration, a sense of an artist studying its medium, and in that strange, objectifying touch, she felt her own sense of self, her own identity as a separate, autonomous being, begin to dissolve. She no longer struggled. The fight was over before it had even truly begun. Her will, her conscious, rational mind, had been utterly and completely defeated, not by force, but by a slow, seductive, and deeply insidious campaign of sensual attrition. Her sense of self, her very identity, seemed to be dissolving into the warm, black, and now occupied water of the pool, a willing and almost grateful surrender to the overwhelming power of this strange, silent, and deeply intimate communion. She was no longer a person. She was a body, an object of fascination, a canvas for the strange, unseen artist of the void. The shameful, illicit pleasure she had felt earlier was no longer a faint, flickering ember. It had grown into a steady, burning fire, a warmth that spread through her limbs, a liquid heat that pooled in the pit of her stomach. Her body, now completely untethered from the moorings of her conscious mind, was responding to the touches with a slow, languid, and deeply involuntary arousal. It was a purely physical response, a biological imperative, a testament to the ancient, amoral power of touch, and it was a final, profound betrayal of everything she had thought she was. She felt the water shift and heave beneath her, a slow, powerful, and deeply rhythmic surge that was not her own. The individual appendages, the sleek, muscular tendrils that were exploring her body, were not separate entities. They were all part of a single, much larger whole, a vast and unseen creature that was now moving in the darkness beneath her. She could feel its immense weight, its incredible, latent power. The pool, which had seemed so shallow and safe, was, she now realized, just the very top layer of a much deeper, much darker abyss. She was no longer just being touched. She was being held. The dozens of individual caresses coalesced into a single, all-encompassing embrace. She was cradled, supported, and possessed by the creature, her body held in a gentle but inescapable grip. The darkness was no longer empty. The silence was no longer absolute. The void was not a void. It was a lair. And she was no longer a client in a spa. She was a guest, an offering, a willing and now eager participant in a strange, ancient, and deeply intimate ritual. She was not alone in the darkness. She was in an embrace. An embrace that was both terrifying and, in a deeply, shamefully honest way, profoundly comforting. The loneliness that had been a constant, low-grade hum in the background of her life was gone, replaced by a sense of a profound, absolute, and terrifying connection. She had come to this place seeking a state of perfect, solitary nullification, a temporary death of the self. And she had found something else entirely. She had found a communion, a merging, a loss of self that was not temporary, but total, absolute, and, she suspected with a final, shuddering sigh of surrender, eternal. A harsh, sterile light exploded overhead, shattering the profound and intimate darkness. The sudden, violent transition from absolute black to brilliant white was a physical shock, a painful, blinding assault on her dark-adapted senses. At the same moment, the disembodied voice of the administrator echoed from the hidden speakers, its calm, professional tone a jarring, obscene intrusion into the silent, sacred space she had been inhabiting. The session, the voice announced with a cheerful finality, was over. The embrace was broken. The communion was ended. She sat up with a convulsive gasp, the black, saline water cascading from her body in warm, heavy sheets. The sudden return of gravity was a dizzying, nauseating sensation. The feeling of her own weight, of her own solid, physical form, was a brutal and unwelcome intrusion. She looked around the now brightly lit room, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror, confusion, and a profound, aching sense of loss. She was alone. Utterly, completely, and absolutely alone. The pool was empty. The black, perfectly still surface of the water was an unbroken, glassy mirror. There was no sign of the creature, no ripple, no disturbance, no evidence of the immense, powerful entity that had held her in its embrace just moments before. There was nothing in the water but her own distorted, wavering reflection, a pale, terrified stranger staring back at her from the inky depths. The creature, the lover, the god of the void, had vanished, as if it had been nothing more than a figment of her own sensory-deprived imagination, a complex and deeply erotic hallucination. But she knew it was not a hallucination. The memory of its touch was too real, too specific, a phantom sensation that still lingered on her skin, a ghostly tracery of its all-encompassing embrace. She scrambled out of the pool, her limbs trembling and uncoordinated, her legs unsteady beneath her. She felt a profound and nauseating sense of violation, a feeling of having been used, of having been a willing and eager participant in her own defilement. Her body, which had felt so alive, so responsive in the darkness, now felt alien, contaminated, a foreign object that no longer belonged to her. She stumbled into the adjoining shower, a sleek, minimalist cubicle of white tile and chrome. She turned the water on, as hot as she could bear, and stood under the scalding spray, scrubbing at her skin with a desperate, frantic energy. She was trying to wash it away, to erase the memory of its touch, to cleanse herself of the invisible, indelible filth of its intimate exploration. But the feeling lingered, a phantom sensation that was not on her skin, but in it, a deep, cellular memory of a communion that could not be washed away. She stayed in the shower until the hot water ran cold, her skin red and raw from the scrubbing. Finally, defeated, she stepped out, her body still trembling with a mixture of shock, shame, and a strange, hollow emptiness. She grabbed a thick, white, impossibly soft towel and began to dry herself, her movements slow and mechanical, her mind a numb, static-filled void. And as she was drying her legs, her eyes fell upon a small, reddish mark on her inner thigh. It was a perfect, dark pink circle, about the size of a coin. Her heart began to pound a slow, heavy, and deeply ominous rhythm in her chest. She slowly, deliberately, lowered the towel, her eyes scanning the rest of her body. And she saw them. They were everywhere. On her stomach, on her arms, on her ribs, on the sensitive skin of her neck. Dozens of them. A scattered, horrifying constellation of small, perfectly circular, reddish-purple marks. They were not bruises. They were not rashes. They were the distinct, undeniable, and scientifically impossible imprints of suction cups. The last, fragile remnants of her denial, her desperate hope that it had all been a hallucination, a dream, a trick of a lonely and overstimulated mind, shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The marks were real. They were physical evidence. They were the tracks, the footprints, the signature of the thing that had been in the water with her. It had not just touched her. It had held her. It had attached itself to her. It had left its mark, its claim, its brand, upon her skin. She stood before the full-length mirror in the changing room, her body a canvas of a horrifying, impossible intimacy. The beautiful, sterile, and serene spa was not a sanctuary. It was a feeding ground. The sensory deprivation tank was not a tool for therapy. It was a hunting blind. And she had not been a client. She had been the bait. And something, some silent, unseen, and very, very real creature, had taken it. She was no longer just a woman who had had a strange, unsettling experience. She was a survivor of an attack, a victim of a crime so bizarre, so impossible, that there was no one in the world she could tell. She got dressed in a numb, robotic daze, the expensive, minimalist clothes of the spa feeling like a costume, a flimsy, civilized disguise for the marked, contaminated thing she had become. She walked out of the changing room, through the silent, serene corridors, and back to the main reception area. The administrator behind the polished white desk looked up and gave her a warm, professional, and utterly solemn. He asked her if she had enjoyed her session, if she felt rested, renewed. She could only nod, a single, jerky movement, the words of her horror trapped in her throat like a shard of glass. She had been renewed, all right. She had been remade. And the thing that she had been remade into was something new, something marked, and something, she suspected with a final, soul-crushing wave of terror, no longer entirely her own. She dressed in a profound and heavy silence, her mind a numb, static-filled void that refused to process the impossible reality of what had just occurred. The administrator at the front desk smiled at her, a perfect, professional, and utterly soulless display of white teeth, and asked her if she felt renewed. She nodded, a single, convulsive jerk of her head, unable to form the words to describe the grotesque and terrifying nature of her renewal. She walked out of the spa's serene, white-walled sanctuary and into the harsh, unforgiving light of the afternoon sun, which felt like a physical, hostile assault. The city around her, with its noise, its crowds, its mundane, everyday reality, seemed like a dream, a flimsy, painted backdrop against which her own, private, and deeply visceral horror was now unfolding. She moved through it like a ghost, her body on autopilot, her mind still trapped in the warm, black, and occupied water of the tank. She made it home, her apartment, once a safe and personal sanctuary, now feeling like a sterile, temporary holding cell. She needed to be sure. She needed to see the evidence again, to confirm that the marks were not a hallucination, a trick of the spa's strange, disorienting light. She went into her bathroom, a clean, safe, and brightly lit space, and stood before the large, familiar mirror. With trembling hands, she took off her clothes, her eyes fixed on her own reflection, a pale, terrified stranger staring back at her. And she saw them. The marks were still there, a scattered, horrifying constellation of small, perfectly circular, reddish-purple bruises. They were not fading. If anything, they seemed darker, more pronounced, a clear and irrefutable testament to the impossible events that had transpired in the dark. She stared at her own reflection, at her familiar but now alien body, a canvas for a monstrous and secret intimacy. Her body was no longer her own. It was a marked territory, a claimed possession, a living, breathing record of a crime that had no name. The shame and the horror were so profound, so absolute, that they transcended tears, transcended screams, and settled into a cold, hard, and permanent knot of dread in the pit of her stomach. She was a walking, breathing piece of evidence for an impossible, unspeakable truth. And then, as she was staring at her own, marked reflection, she felt it. A movement. It was not on her skin, not the phantom caress of a remembered touch. It was inside her. A deep, internal, and undeniably animate flutter in her lower abdomen. It was a sensation that was both profoundly alien and, in a deeply, terrifyingly familiar way, instantly recognizable. It was the feeling of life. A new life. A life that was not her own, a life that had been planted there, in the dark, by the silent, unseen, and very, very real creature in the water. Her gaze dropped from her own terrified face to her stomach. It was flat, as it had always been, the familiar, gentle curve of her own, healthy, and empty body. But as she watched, her breath caught in her throat, a choked, silent scream. It began to change. A slow, rhythmic, and deeply unnatural ripple moved across the surface of her skin, a wave of subcutaneous movement, as if a nest of snakes were stirring beneath the surface. The muscles of her abdomen contracted and relaxed, a silent, grotesque pantomime of a living, breathing thing. And then, it began to grow. Not the slow, patient, and natural growth of a 9-month pregnancy, but a horrifyingly, supernaturally accelerated expansion. Before her very eyes, her flat stomach began to swell, to distend, to round itself into a taut, pregnant-looking dome. The skin stretched, the muscles strained, the entire process of a full-term gestation compressed into a few, silent, and utterly monstrous seconds. It was a biological impossibility, a body horror nightmare made flesh, and it was happening to her, in her own, brightly lit, and perfectly safe bathroom. She did not scream. She could not. The sound was trapped in her throat, a solid, immovable ball of pure, undiluted terror. She could only watch, a silent, horrified witness to the grotesque and rapid transformation of her own body. The thing inside her was not a baby. It was a parasite. A seed, planted by an alien, aquatic god in the warm, dark, and fertile waters of the sensory deprivation tank. And the spa, with its calm, professional smiles and its scientific, therapeutic jargon, was not a place of healing. It was a nursery. A farm. And she was the broodmare. Her stomach continued to swell, its growth now slowing, settling into the full, round, and unmistakable shape of a woman in the final, imminent stages of pregnancy. She placed a trembling hand on its taut, warm surface, and she could feel it. The movement. The life. The strong, steady, and utterly alien presence of the thing that was now living inside her, the thing that had been conceived in darkness and was now rapidly, terrifyingly, and inexorably approaching its own, imminent, and no doubt monstrous birth. The session was, indeed, over. The therapy, however, had just begun.